Once upon a time, a long time ago, in Reykjavik, Iceland, there lived two families. They were not rich by any means. As a matter of fact, they were badly impoverished. They each had a sheep farm which they used to harvest and process wool into clothing. Each family had children. One family had 3 and the other had 2. The family with 3 children had 2 boys and 1 girl. Respectively, their names were Gunnar, Jonas, and Olga. The other family had 2 boys. Their names were Johann and Magnus. It was early October, and they had begun shearing the sheep for their fleece. It wasn't too hard, as the sheep were used to it being done each year. It was more time-consuming than anything. Gunnar, Jonas, and Olga's father, Arnar, would hold the sheep while the boys would take turns shearing it. Olga would carry the fleece to the barn to be cleaned before it could be processed. Once it was cleaned, it would be carded, gilled, combed, drafted, and finally spun into yarn. As yarn, the wool could then be knitted into clothing. Mittens, caps, socks, and sweaters were the most common articles made. They all worked together as a well-knit team. The reason for needing a good production of wool was twofold. 1, to provide warm clothing for the family during the frigid winter months ahead in Iceland. And 2, so either the articles or the wool yarn itself could be sold or traded for food to keep the family and the sheep alive during the icy season. It was hard work, but absolutely essential for survival. And if it wasn't done quickly enough, death was inevitable. Children who helped their families sufficiently prepare and weave the wool during the autumn and winter months would be gifted wool articles of clothing, such as socks, in exchange for their hard work. Those who didn't sufficiently help their families prepare for winter would not receive a garment. That's fair. Johann and Magnus were led through their chores by their father, Leifr. Magnus hated doing his chores. He regularly pushed them off on his younger brother. Johann did them without protest and without tattling on his brother for his laziness. Are you kidding? I would have. He understood whether Magnus helped them or not, it still had to be completed. If not, the whole family would certainly perish. Which is why you should tell on him. October had passed. Arnar's family was humming along nicely, producing massive amounts of wool yarn. Their mother and Olga stayed busy knitting articles of clothing. Leifr's family was struggling, with only 2 boys and one of them not pulling his weight. They were badly falling behind at producing enough wool to sustain themselves. Several of their sheep had already died due to a lack of food, and they were running out of time. I assume they ate those sheep. I would have, Leifr was worried his family would perish. As the pressure mounted, he remembered a story his father told him when he was young about the Jólakötturinn, or the Yule Cat. The Yule Cat was no mere cute little kitten. It was a giant-sized black Norwegian forest cat. Now that's a cool-looking cat. It easily towered over the largest houses. It was 20 to 30 feet tall and weighed at least 600 pounds. It had glowing orange eyes, sharp whiskers, and claws that were 10 to 12 inches long. It was extraordinarily fearsome. Just looking in its eyes alone would make any common man pass out from fright. It would peek into windows on Christmas night and look to see if any of the inhabitants had on new articles of clothing or had been gifted new articles of clothing under the Christmas tree. They didn't wrap presents back then. They only put name tags on them. And it didn't have to be pretty. No, just new. If they did, the Yule Cat would move on to the next house. If they didn't, it would eat the person, no matter adult or child. With its powerful claws and sharp teeth, it would easily chop adults into bite-sized chunks, and it effortlessly swallowed children whole. This is going to get pretty dark, so prepare yourself. As Leifer told his children of the legend, he noticed Magnus seemed undaunted and bored. Finally, Magnus, shaking his head, interrupted.
"Father, there's no such thing as a Yule Cat."
Leifer counted. "Yes, son, there is. I lost my brother to the Yule Cat." Magnus replied.
"You said he died while hunting."
"He did. He was hunting the Yule Cat. You see, his son, your cousin, was eaten by the Yule Cat. So, in a fit of rage and vengeance, he went to hunt down the Yule Cat to exact revenge. Except, it was much too large and powerful. It overwhelmed him and ripped his body to shreds in seconds. We didn't bury his body, only the remaining pieces of it we could locate that it left behind." Magnus was still in disbelief. He looked at his father with heavy skepticism. Leifer told his children that he did not want to lose them like his brother had lost his boy. November was no more, and December had arrived. Time was running out. Magnus eventually did start helping with the chores, begrudgingly. He wasn't completely convinced, but did seem a little more motivated than before. Less sheep were dying of starvation, and the amount of wool being produced was ever increasing. They had produced barely enough wool to keep the sheep and themselves alive. For now. The only problem was he didn't have enough to give gifts to his children for Christmas. That ain't good. At last, Christmas Eve had arrived. Arner and his children came over to visit with Leifer and his children. They had brought food and gifts with them to celebrate their fantastic harvest and hard work. Leifer couldn't reciprocate and was deeply humiliated. However, grateful though, he humbly accepted Arner's gifts for himself and his children. His pride could have caused a real big problem there. Food and drink were shared, and the entire get-together was wonderful. Leifer and his children ate better than they had in a very long time. As the get-together winded down, Arner and his children left to return home. Leifer and his children prepared to go to sleep for Christmas. As they made their way to the bedroom, Leifer advised them to dress in their new clothes before they went to bed. Magnus asked,
"Why?"
Leifer said, "So the Yule Cat will see your new clothes and he won't eat you." Magnus replied,
"Father, don't be ridiculous. There's no such thing as the Yule Cat.
And he stuffed his new clothes in a chest by the bed. Johann, however, heeded the warning and slid on his new wool cap and hopped into bed. Later that night, as they were sleeping, Johann was awakened when he heard a noise right outside his bedroom window. It was the sound of snow crunching. He opened his eyes just slightly. He heard a low cat meow coming from outside. He slowly turned his head to the window and saw two huge, bright orange eyes peering through the window. Then he heard a loud hiss and the sound of glass breaking. Nearly at the same time, he heard his brother scream from across the room. He quickly pulled the covers over his head. As pieces of glass continued to fall on the floor, he heard the muffled screams of terror from his brother. They quickly silenced. Leifer immediately stormed into the room. "What happened? Where's Magnus?" he bellowed. Through mucusy sobs, Johann replied, I don't know." Leifer saw the broken window with blood dripping from the broken glass. He panicked and said, "Stay here. Don't leave this room, no matter what," and forcefully slammed the door. He grabbed his gun from the closet and paired it with a huge knife that he stuck in his waistband. "Dude, you're gonna need a fucking cannon." He bundled up, for it was frigid on this late December night. He grabbed a lantern and hastily left to hunt down the monster that took his child. Being an expert tracker, he went to his son's window and saw humongous cat prints in the snow. He followed them. The snow was still coming down pretty hard. After following the tracks for about an hour, he noticed they were beginning to disappear and get covered by the fallen snow. He had to move faster, so he picked up his pace. I'm guessing he doesn't have snowshoes. His persistence paid off. He noticed they seemed fresher and easier to follow now. They were heading towards Arner's home. In the distance, he heard the enormous cat's meow echo through the woods. He was getting close. He could tell the tracks were made just minutes ago. As he topped the hill and looked down, he saw it. It was gigantic. It was nearly at Arner's house. He was sure Arner and his family would be safe from the wrath of the wicked beast. They had made enough clothes to gift Leifer and his family new garments. He knew what he had to do. Exact retaliation on the horrible, evil creature that had devoured his child. He doused his lantern and slowly crept down the hill, trying not to make any noise. He was nearly in range for his gun when he tripped on a fallen branch hidden by the snow and started rolling down the hill. During his tumble, he held his gun tight, for if he lost it, he would surely meet his demise. Almost at the bottom of the hill and slowing down, he braced himself to try to stop his fall. When he did, he accidentally fired his weapon. The Yule Cat heard the gunshot and immediately whipped its head around and hissed loudly. Its glowing eyes lit up the entire snow-covered field in front of him. The Yule Cat opened its mouth, and gooey drool dripped from its long, fang-like teeth. The monster let out a blood-curdling scream as the oozing spit sprayed forward. Operating solely on instinct at this point, Lifer swiftly reloaded his rifle. The Yule Cat leaped toward Lifer. Terrified and shaking uncontrollably, he aimed down the barrel and fired. The monstrous beast screamed in pain. It stopped, but only for a second. It shook its head, then continued on its death march. Lifer desperately reloaded his gun again. It was nearly on top of him. With no time to properly aim, Lifer released another thundering shot from the hip. It plowed into the abominable cat and stopped its charge in its tracks. However, it was now standing right in front of Lifer, only a few feet away. Lifer saw blood dripping from its furry chest. With nothing to lose, he went to reload once again. However, while reloading, the beast swiped at Lifer with its giant deadly claws. The huge, razor-sharp talons sliced into Lifer's thigh. Blood squirted all over the fresh white snow. Lifer was spun around. His gun flew from his hand and was buried in the deep snow. Oh shit, he's fucked. Now, severely wounded and completely defenseless, the cruel creature stood over Lifer and looked straight down at him, lying in the blood-painted snow. It opened its mouth wide. Spittle drooled out and dripped on Lifer's face. Yuck! The huge, deadly feline pawed at Lifer's crippled body, toying with it. Lifer could do nothing but pray. As he did, the murderous cat leaned down and opened its mouth wide to devour the injured man. Lifer could see a shred of Magnus's nightshirt dangling from one of its back fangs. Could I make this any darker? He closed his eyes and waited for his imminent demise, hoping it would be quick. When suddenly, he heard 3 shots blast through the cold air. He immediately opened his eyes. Lifer struggled desperately to raise his head to see what had happened. The heinous cat turned its attention back toward the house. It was Arner and his 2 boys. They were all 3 standing outside their house, each with a rifle in a firing line. The monster was bleeding badly now from several wounds to its torso. Arner and his small army began reloading. Knowing it was outmatched, the fearsome feline turned and dashed off into the wilderness. Arner and his boys rushed over to Lifer, laying on the ground. A large pool of blood had melted a hole in the deep snow to the ground below. The boys stood guard while Arner checked Lifer's wound. It was lethal. Lifer's femoral artery was slashed in 2. Lifer's face was nearly as white as the surrounding snow. He didn't have much time remaining. He pleaded with Arner. "Please, take care of
Johann for me. He's a good kid and a hard worker.
With that, the light went out in Leifer's eyes, and his body went limp. Overwhelmed, Arner collapsed next to his deceased lifelong friend. Sobbing uncontrollably, he picked up Leifer's dead body and carried him back to his house. Arner and his oldest son Jonas made the trek to Leifer's house to retrieve Johann. When they told him what had happened to his father, Johann didn't believe them. Denial, the first stage of grief. They took Johann back to their house and showed him his father's deceased body. Johann grieved heavily for a very long time. Eventually, he allowed himself to heal. He was welcomed into Arner's family with open arms. He got along great with all of Arner's children. The whole troop worked very well together, like a well-oiled machine. They never, ever encountered the Yule Cat after that. Each following Christmas, Johann would make a pair of stockings for his brother and his father and leave them under the tree.